All right, in this video, I'm going to be talking about an archetype called the critic. Now, I'm going to give it an archetypal reference as this is a trait within all of us, within all of humanity. We all have a little bit of the critic, if it is an inner critic or if it is an outer critic. I'm going to go into where this started, how did it develop in society, how it affects us personally, and how it affects our interactions with others. Now, the critic is, I'm going to give it the archetypal reference of the critic as an archetype within the collective unconscious. Now, the collective unconscious was termed by Carl Jung as a part of aspects of ourselves that we share collectively, that we all have within ourselves in some way, shape, or form. Now, it may manifest in many different ways. We may experience these archetypes within ourselves in many different forms, which I also am going to get into. And the reason why I'm focusing on the critic, well, I'm going to break down some of these archetypal traits that we have within ourselves to understand some of the unconscious aspects of ourselves that could be getting in the way of finding flow and ease and trust with life. The critic, we'll call it the critic, the archetype of the critic that resides within all of us, myself included. I've definitely worked through this. The critic has a trait or a personality of being very harsh towards self, or towards the world, or towards others. And so there can be the inner critic, the critic of maybe being hypercritical towards oneself, towards the body, towards appearances, towards what is said, where the critic can internalize and be hypercritical towards oneself, or it can be an external critic, thus, of course, projecting onto others and the world, and even worse, in the worst case scenario of this archetype, can attack others, and it is prevalent in social media. I'm going to get to the darkest side of the critic, which is that, and I'm going to touch on that towards the very end of this video. But I want to talk about these levels of the critic that exist within humanity, within many of us as well. But first, I'm going to talk about where the critic came from. Where did this critic archetype develop within ourselves and within humanity as a whole? Well, you can think of going back as far as we can think back, hundreds of years of being wrong made in society. Now, this is a societal issue. This is a systemic, you can call it ancestral, you can call it societal. This is something that breeds within the collective unconscious, within the collective shadow. This is a trait that we are all susceptible towards. We all can absorb this within our psyche without even realizing it. That's why it's really important to understand how the critic appears in one's life, and also being very aware through this process we are going to develop greater self-actualization. That's why it's very important to be aware of where this is coming from and how it is showing up in our lives, so that we can create greater awareness and compassion towards ourselves and, of course, towards others. Now, the critic has come from society, it has come from history, it has come from being wrong made as a child. Now, you can think even of your own childhood, of growing up, being told what is right, what is wrong, maybe even being punished for doing things wrong, or saying something wrong, or acting a certain way, or behaving a certain way, or being a certain way. And this we can feel within ourselves that we are wrong, that we are fundamentally wrong. But what happens when our unconscious self within our belief system, if you want to call it that, has a false belief of feeling wrong, then we are going to look at ourselves as being wrong. We can also be very paranoid about our actions, our reactions, what we say, how we look, and we can also turn it into a form of self-isolation and removal from society altogether. If we are very, very critical towards ourselves, we may then feel that we are wrong, that we are fundamentally wrong, and there's nothing or not much that is right with us, with many aspects of ourselves. The other manifestation or outcome from the critic archetype, can be the projection outwardly, right? So if we are also the mirroring effect, if you want to call it that too, if we are dissatisfied within ourselves, feeling that we are wrong and looking at the faults within ourselves and the faults within our life, or how we look, or how we behave, or our body, or even the past, we can then project that outward in very, very unconscious ways, right? And the critic archetype comes from here, not here. The critic archetype comes from the mind. It comes from false programming and false beliefs only. When we are connected with our heart, when we are connected with our authentic self, our true self, when we are connected with compassion and empathy, we see more, we feel more, we sense more. The critic will disappear. But when we are heavily dominant by the critical archetype within ourselves, it comes from here. It does not come from here. The critic will override the heart. And so in school, we may have also been taught to be critical thinkers, which is really good to do. It's important to be a critical thinker. It's important to look at life through new perspectives. But I feel the intensity of that way of viewing life also narrows us into looking at what is wrong. Again, being wrong made. This wrong making also can be associated with shame. It can also be associated with fear. Now, if we tap into our heart and connect with our heart and we feel something differently and we feel something more and we feel something beautiful and we feel something vulnerable, there may also be a fear of being true to that because society is so ingrained and is so hyper-focused on what is wrong in the world and what is wrong with people and what is wrong with ourselves. And this is a very, very intense and prevalent archetype of society that creates extreme divisiveness, can create a lot of fighting, a lot of arguing between one another. And also, of course, projection and attacking one another in the social media space, for example. Now, which I'm going to get to in a moment, because that is the darkest side of criticism, which I see. And I really have been wanting to talk about this for a long time, but I also want to connect the dots of where this is coming from. Because again, when we are operating from the critical archetype, the critic archetype, it comes from here. It comes from completely our unconscious self. When we are not critical, when we have arrived at a place of more love and compassion, we see more. So, for example, again, going back to being critical thinkers, for example, you can think of where the term critical thinkers came from. It is thinking critically towards certain aspects of life, certain infrastructures, looking at life through a different perspective, which again is very important. But it is a very one-dimensional way of looking at life. It is a very one-dimensional way of looking at anything. Through the critical mind, we will become very narrow-minded and focused on what is wrong. And it leads us down a very dangerous path. When we are critical, it is a very narrow-minded way of looking at reality. We are not looking at reality from our heart. We are not looking at reality from our senses. We are not looking at reality from more depth that it deserves. And so when the critical mind comes into action unconsciously from the shadow, it will only look at one thing that is wrong, missing so many other areas that are very important to understand the whole. It will only see one small fraction and one fragment of the bigger picture. So, for example, in the online space, someone says something maybe not polished, or maybe they make a typo, or maybe they dress a certain way, and then all of a sudden people start attacking them and pointing out their flaws and being very aggressive with what this person is doing or saying or how they're communicating, for example. When they're in that hypercritical state, when they're being overridden by the critic archetype, they are not seeing the entirety of the picture of the person, of the situation. So what if this person has a whole story behind them, which they do? What if there's so much more to a person's story that can be understood and seen through the lens of empathy and compassion and curiosity and understanding? Which that is the case, of course. There are so many layers behind every situation that the critic will overlook, because the critic will feed one's ego to, in that very, very single moment, to make them feel smarter, to make them feel superior, to make them feel like they are the all-knowing. It feeds into the ego. It all comes from here. It does not come from here. And so the critic thrives off of feeding the ego, for one, and that's what happens in the online space, for example. That's what happens when others will attack others and make them, for a moment, in that very second in time, make the critic feel superior towards others because they have pointed out a flaw. And when they have pointed out a flaw, then it makes their ego gives them the puffiness. I'm smarter. I saw what's wrong with you. I saw a flaw. I'm better than you. I'm smarter than you. So it gives the ego a hit. It gives the ego a boost. And now this is happening all unconsciously. This is happening under the surface. So when the critic comes out, the archetype of the critic comes out in full force, it is a very unconscious aspect of self, and it is a very singular aspect of self, and very single in the way of being very narrow in the viewpoint, in the understanding of the bigger picture. And so the critic is sometimes perpetuated by the ego, or it feeds the ego. It feeds the ego with a bit of a superiority complex. It can make someone in a very, very small moment in time feel like they are smarter, like they are better. When in reality, when the critic is projecting outward and showing the flaws, or exposing the flaws, or pointing out flaws towards other people or towards life itself, it is only a mirror of the dissatisfaction that one has within themselves. Now, if one is confident within themselves and feels whole and within their heart, they will not feel the need to criticize. And in fact, they will see more about the person. They will see into the dimensions. They will feel, they will have empathy, and they will have compassion. So the critic singles in on the imperfection and the flaws, and then it works within the ego, justifying the actions of this particular archetype. So if the critic is being critical towards another person or towards life, the next level is the justification for it. I have a right. That person is not smart. That person looks like an idiot. This person is this person is that. And so the justification will come in, and also the critical thinking factor could come in of, well, I'm being critical, I'm looking at this in the way that it needs to look. There's a whole story that will be invented by the ego to justify one's actions and their behaviors. Now, this goes into the book, the work of Dr. Michael Lincoln, who I reference often. His studies have proven that criticism forms arthritis and stiffness within the joints within the body. Now, if you can think everything is energy, as it is, when we are critical and when we're holding on to criticism, if it is self-criticism, it can also lead to control, not letting go of one's thoughts towards a certain viewpoint or towards a certain perspective. And speaking of perspectives, before I go into the body, this does narrow our perspective. Now, I already touched on it, but it does significantly narrow our perspective without the ability to look beyond, the one aspect that we are focused on and holding on to. There are many different stories interwoven into this experience. There are many dimensions woven into this experience. When we drop into our heart and when we connect with our feelings and we observe and we don't judge or criticize, but we simply look a bit broader, we will see more about the story, and then we will realize that what we had been seeing was only a small fraction of the truth. And so this leads into the body, of course, because you can think again as everything is energy. And if we are holding on to that one aspect of reality, being certain that this is the truth, then we are also creating some kind of manifestation and reaction within our body, because our body is the final communication center. So what does criticism also do? It also shuts people out. It blocks people. It blocks life itself. It closes relationships. And it does harm the body because we're holding on to tension. We are holding on to old beliefs. We are holding on to old ways, and we're holding on to control. And criticism, the archetype of the critic, is a very controlling archetype. It likes to be right. And it likes to prove that it is right as well, and hold on to its ways without budging. And you can think of what that does within the body, or you can imagine what that does within the body. It equates to rigidity, it equates to control, and it equates to a lack of flow and trust with the world. And so the archetype of the critic, in its eyes, in its perspective, it is right, and it sees the world in a certain specific lens, only based on what it sees and perceives, not on the true aspect of reality or the true relationship with reality. And so you can get all these different opinions clashing in the world because everyone has their own right or wrong built into their unconscious self. So everyone sees the world a little bit differently. And this the archetype of the critic can come in and form a story within the unconscious of a certain belief and of a certain perspective. Also, of course, influencing one's behaviors, what they say, what they do, and how they show up or don't show up, because, of course, it will create rigidity and control and suppress one's full abilities and capabilities. Also, creating a great amount of fear of letting go. That's where the ego comes in. That's where a great deal of ego wrestling is involved, to let go and open up to maybe there's more. Maybe there's more to this. Maybe I should connect with my heart and tune in a little bit differently. That's why this archetype requires a great deal of observation to work through. Connecting the dots first with where this came from, perhaps within the family structure, within the family origin. Then, of course, observing one's triggers and reactions to life, the response, the unconscious response mechanisms that become activated throughout any moment in life. This can be activated by watching TV. This can be activated through certain relationships. This can be activated even within oneself, being critical towards one's looks, one's body, maybe even critical towards the path of life or the unfoldings of life. Very, very, very unconscious in the shadow. This archetype resides very deep within. So going back to the body, when we hold on to criticism, when we feel that our story is right and other stories are wrong, when we have a certain perception on reality of how we think it should be, and of course, justify those actions and reactions, it will manifest in how we behave. It will manifest in our delivery of communication. It will manifest in how we feel internally on a deep level, and it will definitely manifest in the body. So again, things like arthritis, joint issues, stiffness within the joints, knee pain, hip pain, a lack of fluidity and flow is what develops. And you can imagine even being in flow and trusting the process of life and being open to receive and observe life, right? So when we are in the flow of receiving and observing and partaking, giving, if you will, helping, however it is, this fluid experience that we can find ourselves in, you can almost tell the energetic difference between being in flow with life and being in control, or being critical, or being rigid. I know the answers. I want to hold on to my perceptions. The world is unsafe. The world is this. These people are like this. This person's wrong. This person's wrong. So when we are even on ourselves, towards ourselves, we can very much contain ourselves and make our world very small with this particular archetype. So it is very restrictive. It is very confining. And because we also confine our true potential, we enclose and we box in our true potential, then what's going to happen? There's going to be an inner conflict constantly, and it's going to come out in projections. And so we see that happening in our social media space, for example. I mean, I've had it happen on my channel. Everyone, I'm sure, has had it happen on their channel, because for some reason, this space allows people from the comfort of their home to project onto strangers. They would never do this in person, most likely, most of them anyway. But what they watch and who they happen to find on social media will trigger their inner critic. And that inner critic will come out as a shadow and project onto these people creating content. Or they will even go further and create content against some of the other people who are creating content. And this is a loop that is so prevalent and so thick in the online space right now, or even on television. There is an incredible shadow that has developed, a collective shadow in the online space because of the inner critic, because of the critic archetype. And so people go into the online space and they feel safe and comfortable projecting their shadow onto others, which is the lowest form and the darkest form of the critic. When one is completely in their unconscious self, operating unconsciously, and lashing out to others and projecting onto others, and even in very subtle ways, directing their inner critic towards others, they are creating a chain of events. It hurts people on the other side. It will feed that person's ego, the critic's ego momentarily, but it also does create some kind of energetic response within one's body. When we are allowing the shadow of the critic to perpetuate within ourselves, within our psyche, within our body, what do you think it's going to do to us separately, individually? It's going to harm us even more because we are removing ourselves more and more from our heart. We are not allowing ourselves to connect with empathy, with understanding, with support, with kindness. It is removing oneself more and more and more away from their heart. And so in its place, the shadow, the critic, is going to get stronger and stronger and stronger. And this is happening more and more in the online space. There are beautiful things happening in the online space as well, but there's also this great collective shadow that still exists. And it does exist in the spiritual community. Yes, very much so. It exists everywhere. And I truthfully don't like saying the spiritual community, but I will say it just for now because that's all we really can go by. But it exists everywhere. And the critic has a level of safety in the home space to project outwardly and to release the distaste towards self, and also its false belief of how people should be, creating a story and a narrative based on their inner false beliefs, based on their false perception, based on their removal from their heart, and therefore choosing a stronger relationship with the critic. It is a form of harm because the people on the other side, we don't know where they're coming from. We don't know what they're dealing with. We don't know what they're going through. We don't know the steps that they've had to go through to even get to where they are. So when the critic comes out and attacks these certain individuals or people or one another on the internet, for example, it is creating a great deal of harm towards one another. We all have the critic archetype within ourselves. This is a simple exercise of self-observation and self-awareness. Once we catch ourselves in the moment of our unconscious behaviors, if it is a trigger, if we lash out at someone, we can correct it. And that's all we need to do, is be aware and integrate more compassion and self-awareness for ourselves and for others. And what's going to happen in that place when we start to shift from our critic to our empath, we are going to be more supportive, we are going to be more understanding, and we are also going to be able to create incredible change within our lives, if it is within our body, if it is within our own goals and dreams and desires, but we also will empower others. It's a win-win situation all around. All right, so I hope this video offered a bit more guidance on your path and beyond, and I look forward to seeing you very soon. Take care.